I'm Waverly Hutchins, 29, a licensed occupational therapist working at a rehabilitation center in Chattanooga, Tennessee. For 3 years, I sent my older brother and his wife $800 every month. Rent, utilities, car insurance, even their internet bill. A total of nearly $65,000 straight out of my paycheck because my brother kept telling me he was one break away from turning his life around. But on the day I gave birth to my first child, he didn't come, didn't call, didn't text. When I finally reached him from the hospital bed, still hooked up to monitors, my sister-in-law picked up and said, "We're kind of busy right now." I hung up. My hands were shaking, but something inside me went completely still. By the time my daughter took her first breath, I had already made my decision. 2 hours later, my brother's phone started blowing up. I didn't answer. I was done. I need to back up, because none of this makes sense without context. My brother is 4 years older than me. Growing up, he was the one everyone rooted for. Charming, funny, good with people. My parents used to say he could talk his way into any room. The problem was he could never figure out what to do once he got there. He drifted through 2 years of community college, picked up a trade certification he never used, and bounced between jobs, selling insurance, doing property management, and once Maze briefly, investing in a food truck concept that never materialized. His wife was similar energy. She had a degree in graphic design but hadn't worked in her field in years, picking up occasional freelance gigs she'd drop after a few weeks. They got married young. By the time I graduated with my master's degree and passed my licensure exam, they had already burned through his parents' wedding gift money, a small inheritance from a great uncle, and 2 rounds of help from my parents. My parents by then were retired and stretched thin themselves. They couldn't keep covering it. I could. And I was raised to believe family comes first. So when my brother called me 2 months into my first real job and said he was 3 weeks behind on rent, I transferred $900 without thinking twice. He said he'd pay it back. He never did. But I kept telling myself it was temporary, that he just needed a little more time to get stable. A year in, the temporary arrangement had quietly become permanent. I was wiring $2,800 on the first of every month, covering their rent in a 2-bedroom apartment in Nashville, their electric and gas, and the car payment on his truck, because he needed reliable transportation to find work. My fiancé Oliver noticed before I admitted it to myself. He'd see me on the phone with my brother late at night, voice tight, and he'd wait until I hung up and ask carefully, "How much this time?" I'd tell him and he'd go quiet in that way. That meant he was trying not to say something he'd regret. We'd go to bed not fighting, but not talking either. He wasn't wrong to worry. We were saving for a house. Every month I sent to my brother was a month longer we had to wait. My friend Petra, who I've known since undergrad, was less careful with her words. She sat across from me at a coffee shop one afternoon and said, flat out, "You know this is never going to stop, right? You're not helping him get back on his feet. You're just paying for his feet to stay exactly where they are." I laughed it off. Told her she didn't know the whole story. She gave me a look I still think about. The thing that kept me locked in wasn't love. Exactly. It was guilt. My brother and I had a rough stretch in our mid-20s where we barely spoke. Our parents' health had started declining, and I was the one nearby, managing appointments and prescriptions and grocery runs, while he lived 2 states away and called maybe once a month. When they passed, 18 months apart, I felt this hollow grief that I think he did too, in his own way. Afterward, he moved closer. Said he wanted to be around family. Said he'd changed. I wanted to believe him. Sending money felt like a way to hold on to something I thought we'd rebuilt. But they never asked how I was doing. Not once in 3 years did my brother call just to talk. Every conversation started with something they needed. My sister-in-law would text me photos of things they were grateful for, little staged thank you moments, but there was never any actual warmth behind them. It was transactional. I was their transaction. Oliver proposed the spring before I got pregnant, and we planned a small ceremony for the following year. When I told my brother, he said, "That's great, Waverly. Hey, our lease is up in July. Do you think you could add a little extra that month to cover the deposit on the new place?" That was the whole conversation. I sat in my car afterward and stared at the steering wheel for a long time. I got pregnant 7 months later. Oliver and I were over the moon. I told my brother on a video call. He said congrats, and immediately pivoted to asking if I'd looked into whether maternity leave would affect my contributions. That word, contributions. Like it was a charity I ran and he was checking on the quarterly numbers. My due date was in February. I went into labor on a Thursday morning, earlier than expected. Oliver drove me to the hospital and I texted my brother from the car. I'm in labor. Baby is coming today. He responded with a thumbs up emoji and keep us posted. Keep us posted. 13 hours of labor. Oliver never left my side. My aunt, my mom's older sister who had driven up from Georgia the week before to be nearby, was in the waiting room the entire time. She had brought a bag of homemade food and a card she'd had the ladies from her church sign. When they finally let her in to see us, she cried before I did. My brother didn't come. When the baby was about 2 hours old, and I was still foggy and exhausted and completely overwhelmed with love and fear and awe, I picked up my phone. There were no missed calls from him. I dialed anyway. My sister-in-law picked up after the third ring, and I heard noise in the background, the television, and maybe other voices. I said, "She's here, my daughter is here." And she said, "Oh, wonderful, congratulations, we're kind of busy right now, can we call you back?" And I said, "Okay," and she hung up. Oliver was watching me from the chair across the room, holding our daughter, and I must have had a look on my face because he didn't ask any questions. He just shook his head slowly. I looked at my daughter, this tiny, brand new person who had just arrived, and something shifted in me permanently. I didn't cry. I didn't call back. I opened my banking app. I canceled the automatic transfer scheduled for the 1st of next month. I logged into the joint utility accounts I'd foolishly set up in my name to help manage their bills and started the process of removing myself. I called the car insurance company and removed my brother's truck from my policy. It took about 40 minutes, working one-handed while my daughter slept on my chest. Oliver sat next to me by then, reading over my shoulder, and he didn't say a word. Just put his hand on my back. 3 days later, I got a voicemail from my brother. Not a call I could answer. Not a text I could screenshot, a voicemail left at 11:47 p.m. His voice was low and strange. He said I was being dramatic and selfish, and that I'd put them in a terrible position and he hoped I was happy with myself. He said I'd always had a way of making things about me. He said, and I remember this exactly because I played it 4 times. "You'll regret pulling this stunt. I know things about you, Waverly. People would be very interested in what I know." I stood in the hallway of our house listening to it, my daughter asleep in the next room. My hands weren't shaking this time. I was cold and clear and I knew exactly what I was going to do. I forwarded the voicemail to my aunt and to Oliver. Then I texted my college friend Petra, who had moved into immigration law, but still had a sharp legal mind and a sharper instinct for when things were heading somewhere dangerous. She called me back within 10 minutes and said, "Save everything, don't respond to a word. I'm coming over tomorrow." She sat at my kitchen table the next morning with her laptop and a yellow legal pad, and we went through everything methodically. 3 years of wire transfers totaling $64,800. The voicemail. Every text from my sister-in-law with variations of "so grateful" and "couldn't do it without you," that now read like a paper trail of manipulation. Petra's eyes moved across the screen carefully. When she looked up, she said, "The voicemail is a threat. It's vague, but it's a threat. And depending on what he thinks he knows, it could become harassment." She told me to file a police report now, before anything escalated, to establish a record. Oliver drove me to the precinct that same afternoon. The officer who took my report was businesslike but thorough. She documented the voicemail, noted the financial pattern, and flagged it for their records. It wasn't an arrest, but it was a paper trail. That mattered. 2 days after that, I got a call from my bank. A fraud investigator said someone had called their customer service line, identified themselves as me, and attempted to regain access to an account I'd recently updated my contact information on. The caller had my old address, my old phone number from 2 years ago, and most of my birthday, but failed the security questions. The bank had blocked the attempt and flagged it. I sat down on the floor of my kitchen when I heard that. My brother had my information. Of course he did. I'd been his financial manager for 3 years. I knew every detail of his life, and he knew enough of mine to cause trouble if he wanted to. There's something I hadn't told anyone, not Oliver, not Petra, not my aunt. For about 2.5 years, while I was sending my brother money every month, I had quietly been building a separate savings account at a different bank. I started it with $150 a month, an amount so small I could absorb it without feeling it. And I added more when I could. It was instinct more than strategy. Some quiet part of me knew, even when I was telling myself this was temporary, that it might not be. The account had grown to just over $17,000. I hadn't touched it once. When I told Oliver that evening, sitting on the couch with the baby between us and her little bouncer, he stared at me for a long moment. "You've been saving while sending them almost $2,000 a month?" I nodded. He laughed a short, disbelieving laugh and said, "Waverly, that's the smartest thing you've ever done." Petra's reaction when I told her the next day was more practical. "Good. And they don't know about it." I confirmed they didn't. She said, "Let's keep it that way. I'll help you make sure it stays locked down." The question the voicemail raised, though, was what my brother thought he knew. I had no secrets, not really. Nothing embarrassing or illegal or damaging. But I lay awake thinking about it because the uncertainty itself was its own kind of weapon. He was counting on that. Counting on me to panic and pay. I didn't panic. I called my aunt. She is my mother's older sister, 71 years old, and she has a quality I have always admired. She does not raise her voice when she is at her most serious. When I explained everything, the voicemail, the fraud attempt, the 3 years, she listened without interrupting. Then she said, "I need you to tell me where they live." I told her. She said, "I'm going over there." I asked if she wanted me to come. She said, "Absolutely not. You have a new baby. I'll handle this." What I know of what happened next comes partly from my aunt afterward, and partly from a neighbor of my brother's who messaged me on Facebook, 3 days later, a woman I had never met, saying she wanted me to know she'd seen the whole thing, and that she was sorry for what my family had put me through. My aunt drove 45 minutes to Nashville, walked to my brother's apartment, and knocked on the door. When my sister-in-law answered, my aunt said, calmly and with full eye contact, "I know what you did to her. I know how long it went on. And I want you to understand that it is finished, and that if either of you attempts to contact Waverly or Oliver, or that baby in any threatening way again, I will be back with a lawyer and a very detailed account of the last 3 years." My brother appeared behind his wife. My aunt looked at him directly and said, "Your mother would be ashamed of you." And then she left. My sister-in-law called me that evening. I did not answer. She left a voicemail that was 6 minutes long and mostly her crying and saying I had abandoned family, and that I didn't understand how hard things had been. I sent it to Petra without listening to it again. Petra added it to the file. About a week later, my uncle on my father's side called me from Knoxville, a quiet man I hadn't spoken to in almost 2 years. He said he'd been cleaning out an old filing cabinet and found documents from my grandfather's estate, paperwork from when he'd passed 8 years earlier. He sounded uncomfortable, like he'd been sitting on this for days deciding whether to call. He told me that my grandfather had set aside a small trust when he died, $40,000, split evenly between me and my brother. My father had been the trustee. The trust was supposed to have been distributed when I turned 25, 4 years ago. But my uncle had found a letter indicating my brother had contacted my father shortly before his death and asked that his share be released early, and that my father, in his final months and not fully himself, had signed off on it. My brother had taken his $20,000 4 years ago. Mine had never been released. I don't have a clean word for what I felt in that moment. My grandfather had saved that money for us. My father had meant to give it to me. My brother had known about it the entire time he was taking $2,800 a month from my paycheck, and he had said nothing. My uncle sent me a scanned copy of the original trust documents and the letter the same day. I called Petra before I'd even finished reading them. She went quiet for a moment and then said, "Okay, this changes things. Your brother has been taking money from you with full knowledge that you were also owed money you didn't know about. That is not just selfish. That is calculated." She started talking about probate and breach of fiduciary duty and contacting a trust attorney, and I let her talk because my mind was somewhere else. I was thinking about every phone call. We're barely making rent. Every text from my sister-in-law, with photos of their dinner out, the trip they took to the Smoky Mountains, on a deal, the new couch they'd bought because the old one was falling apart. I was thinking about the 3 years I'd worked overtime, skipped vacations, and delayed buying the house Oliver and I had been dreaming about, because I was sending nearly $22,000 a year to a man who already had $20,000 of my grandfather's money sitting somewhere. Oliver's reaction was the quietest anger I've ever seen from him. He didn't yell. He just went very still and said, "We're getting that money back." I retained a trust attorney that week. She reviewed the documents and confirmed my uncle's reading. The original trust had not been properly dissolved, only my brother's portion had been distributed, and the trustee failure, my father's unilateral decision, made outside the trust's terms, gave me legal standing to make a claim. It would take time. There would be paperwork and probably pushback, but it was real. In the meantime, the police report I'd filed worked in ways I hadn't expected. When my brother received a formal letter from Petra's firm outlining the harassment and the attempted account access, something shifted. The calls stopped. The voicemails stopped. The silence that followed was eerie, but it was also a relief so physical I felt it in my chest. My sister-in-law's sister called me 2 weeks later. I'd met her maybe 3 times in my life, a younger woman named Evie who I had no real relationship with. She said she was calling because she thought I should know that my brother and his wife were telling people in their circle that I had cut them off out of nowhere because I was jealous of their marriage. She said she didn't believe it, and she wanted me to know she was sorry. I thanked her and didn't say much else, but I appreciated the call more than she knew. The moment that broke something open in me, the moment I think about when I need to remember why I made the choices I made, came on a Thursday afternoon about 6 weeks after my daughter was born. I was sitting in my aunt's kitchen. She had made chicken and rice, the same thing she made every time any of us needed feeding, and she had my daughter in her arms and was talking to her in that soft, private way older women talk to babies, telling her she was already somebody, that she had love all around her, that she was going to be fine. I started crying completely without warning. My aunt looked up and didn't ask why, just moved to sit next to me and put one arm around my shoulder while she kept holding the baby. I cried for a while. For my parents, I think. For the version of my brother I had spent 3 years trying to fund into existence. For the years I had given to something that never gave anything back. When I finally stopped, my aunt said very quietly, "You didn't fail him, he failed you." I've thought about those words every day since. The trust claim took 4 months to resolve. With the documentation my uncle had provided, the original trust terms, and the attorney's persistence, I received my $20,000 in a structured settlement. My brother did not contest it, which I think meant either he knew he had no legal ground to stand on, or Petra's letter had scared him more than I realized. I never spoke to him during the process. His attorney communicated with mine. That was enough. I used part of the settlement as the down payment on the house Oliver and I had been putting off for 2 years. We bought a 3-bedroom in a quiet neighborhood in Chattanooga with a backyard that gets afternoon light. The first weekend we were there, Oliver built a raised garden bed along the back fence, and I planted lavender and rosemary and some tomatoes that probably won't survive the summer, but I planted them anyway. Our daughter slept in a bassinet in the corner of the kitchen the whole time, completely unbothered. My brother sent me a single text 6 months after everything was settled. It said, "I hope you're doing well. I'm sorry things ended up the way they did." I read it twice. I didn't respond. I don't think I owe him a conversation, and I'm not interested in a half apology that takes no responsibility for anything specific. Maybe one day that will change. Maybe it won't. That's something I've had to learn to hold without resolution. My sister-in-law never reached out. My aunt comes over every other Sunday and stays for dinner. Petra is my daughter's godmother. Oliver and I are finally living in the house we always talked about, doing the ordinary things we kept pushing back. Life is not dramatic, it's just mine. I spent 3 years believing that taking care of my brother was the same as being a good sister. What I know now is that there is a difference between love and subsidy. Real love asks something of both people. What I had given was money with no return, patience with no reciprocation, and loyalty to someone who had long since stopped being loyal to me. Setting that down wasn't giving up on family. It was finally understanding what family is supposed to mean. My daughter is asleep in the next room right now. She has no idea yet that any of this happened, and that is exactly how it should be.